All right, Bellator Christie, Season 7, Question Zone Episode 6, the Season 7 finale beginning in 3, 2, and 1. Good evening, good morning, wherever you may be, from across the nation to around the world. This is the Bellator Christie podcast, where we take Christian truth into the arena of ideas. Hello, friends. My name is Dr. Brian Chilton, rejoined by the one and only, often imitated, never duplicated, cowboy apologist Curtis Evelo, who is back in the saddle again. And let me just be the first to say it is good to have Curtis with us tonight, as we, believe it or not, are about to have our season finale. This is our last scheduled podcast for season 7. We do have on tap a bonus episode that'll be coming your way sometime likely in May. And that is going to be a panel discussion with the writers of a new book coming out, published by Nexus Publishing, an imprint of Illitive House Press, called Why Creationism Still Matters. We were talking with the publishers, and they asked us to hold off on that podcast to closer to the time of publication. And it looks like everything, all the pistons are firing. It looks like we are set for a May release date if all goes well. And so, barring any setbacks, it looks like we're probably going to go live with a book with a launch sometime in May. So you'll hear more about that as we get closer to the time of publication. I also want to let you know just real briefly about Season 8. Season 8 will have 24 episodes, and we will have some panel discussions blended in with those episodes. It'll be part of the schedule. Look for that schedule to release on BellatorChristie.com sometime over the summer break. We're still tweaking a few details, but we're going to talk about three major events, three major theological topics. We're going to talk about angelology and demonology, angels and demons. That's going to be the first. We may even have a panel discussion on Mike Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, and this is something that's already in the works. So we're excited about the potential of having a panel discussion on this topic. Then we're going to talk about ecclesiology. That's the study of the church. Here we talk about what's the role of pastor and deacon, what is baptism all about, what's the Lord's Supper all about, the issues, what's the nature and purpose of the church.
Yeah.
That'll be part of that section. And then finally, we top it off with a study on eschatology. And beloved, that's going to be the last season that we're going to have our systematic theology series. And then after that, we're going to go back to talking about maybe some episodes on biblical theology. I envision we're going to probably have a lot more apologetic episodes, and maybe even some standalone episodes talking about current events coming up in future seasons. So that's kind of giving you an idea of what's yet to come. But hopefully next season, Curtis and I, we have had all kind of technical snafus this season. But God is getting us through it. In fact, I think He's going to take us through and to even greater places, going through some of these challenges that we have. We've had technical difficulties. We've had problems with the podcast not wanting to go to the website at one time, not even sure if we were even going to be able to continue the podcast as it was. So, by the grace of God, we're still here. We're still trucking right along, and we have for you tonight a wonderful episode of the podcast and a wonderful question zone. And so, with that in mind, we'll turn the reins over to our trusty cowboy apologist, the one and only Curtis Evelo.
All right. Well, it's great to have the final countdown, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Let's just jump right in, Brian. Go to number one. The first question here is, since we are made in the, well, let's back up here. Let me talk about this for a second. So what I did is I took some questions from various different interviews or podcasts that we've had just recently. The first one is from the Image of God podcast, the interview you had with Michelle. The first question is, since we were made in the image of God, what is the image? Is it the fleshly part or is it the soul spirit part?
That's an excellent question. And just to be quite, just to be upfront with you, it's as I went through that episode and also the one with Dr. Purser, as we were talking about the purpose of humanity. Um,
Yeah.
this issue of the image of God is a lot more complicated. I mean, I guess I never really thought through the details of it as much
Yep.
as I
Yep.
should. I do think that there is an aspect of us being made in the image of God that we are tripartite beings, just as God is. I mean, God is one. There's a simplicity to God, but He's still a triunity in being Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And in like manner, He's made us in that image because if you think of the Father being kind of like the mind, and you think of the Son being like the arm, and you think of the Spirit as being that aspect, the energy of God applying things to the world, bringing things into action, maybe even the legs, if you would think of it like that. In like manner, human beings have a mind, they also have a soul, and they have a body. They have those immaterial parts. Now, here again, we got to be careful not to push it too far. But I think there is a sense where we are a triunity as God is a triunity. But also, I think that Dr. Purser, what he said, um, was really powerful. That there's a relational aspect to the image of God. That we are made with the purpose of being in relationship with God and being in relationship with each other. And I was even thinking, and when you sent this question earlier this week, I've really been thinking through probably more deeply about this question than any other, because if you think about the difference between, and we'll probably get more into this in the next question, if you think about the differences of those who are saved and those who are not, um, those who are saved are actualizing the image that God gave them, whereas those who are not have the potential to have that relationship, but it's not coming to fruition. But we can get into more into that as we get in the next question. But the image of God is something that's given to each and every person, no matter where they're from. Is something that is a shared aspect, a shared trait in humanity. I think it has something to do with the fact that we are soul, spirit, and body, but I do think it has a lot to do with that relational aspect as well.
So number two, then the question kind of comes out of the once saved, always saved idea. And if somebody, if that is true, or as we hold it, you're saved, but you can relinquish your salvation. Can a person, or can we ever lose the image of God?
Well, I think that there's a distinction that needs to be made there because the image of God is something we're given as being part of the human race. Every person, whether you're saved or
Right.
unsaved, has the image of God. I think what the difference really comes out, and as Dr. Purser was talking about, he even brought up something that to consider. Even people in hell still have the image of God. Now, here's one of the reasons why I'm not a conditionalist and why I'm not an annihilationist, because I don't believe the soul can be destroyed. I think that when you talk, if the soul is the breath of God breathed into man, there is an internal spark within humanity that can never be destroyed. If we think of the spirit like that. And so when the spirit joins that physical flesh, then there is a spark of the eternal within that person. But here's the problem. And here's the big difference between if we think of the here's the big difference we see between those who are saved and unsaved, those who are in heaven and those who are in hell. if the part of that image of God, it means that we are relational beings, that we all have that potential to have relationships with each other, and we all have that potential to have that relationship with God. Now, the person who is saved, the person who has that relationship with God, they're actualizing, or they're bringing into act that potential that they were made for. They're living out their potential, to say it in more in a clearer fashion. They're living out their potential. They're living to their fullest potential. Whereas a person who doesn't have that relationship with God, they still have that ability to have a relationship with God, but they're not living it out. They're not living out their full potential. Uh, the fullness of the fruition of our potential, the fruition of what we're made for, was to know and be known by God, to love and be loved by God, to love God and be loved by God. So when we have that relational aspect, we have that relationship with God, we are fulfilling the purpose for which we were made. And if you really stop and think about it, and here again, this we're going to get into this in the next question, leading kind of into the next question, the whole process that brings human beings into being is an act of love, or at least it's supposed to be. That's the way it was intended to be, an act of love bringing forth life. Well, it was an act of love from God that brought forth all of creation into existence. And it's an act of love when God breathes that spirit into a person. So, can we lose the image of God? No, I don't think we can. Now, whether we or not we can lose our salvation, that's a whole other theological sticking point that that may be beyond the scope of what we want to cover tonight.
Yep. So then let's just jump into this next one, which I feel is something that we really need to have a discussion about in multiple ways, and maybe even have a full podcast on this topic sometime. And the question comes down to, how can or will our view of the image of God, the Imago Dei, affect the IVF industry?
And here you're talking about in vitro fertilization, correct?
Correct. Yep. Yep.
So I don't know. So without getting too graphic, um, we most people who listen to this podcast are going to be adults, so we know how we've heard the birds and the bees. We know about the birds and the bees. Okay, so the natural process is, what was that, Curtis?
So what's that?
Well, you have a man, you have a woman, they fall in love. It's supposed to be get married. But
That
anyhow,
was the bulls and the heifers.
yeah. But the process is you have the sperm and you have the egg, they unite together, and at some point God breathes the breath of life. Now, that you can't have a fertilized egg that doesn't take. My wife and I, we had two miscarriages before we had a son, and didn't know if we were going to be able to have children. Um, but I do believe that we have two children waiting on us in heaven, because they did have life, but they died in the womb. With in vitro fertilization, if I understand it correctly, you still have the sperm, you still have the egg, but it's processed differently. It's processed in a lab. So I don't think that image of God would change per se, because you still have that working functionality of sperm and egg. And then, if I'm understanding correctly, I think that fertilized egg is then placed back in the womb of the mother, and
Yep.
then it takes. So I don't think there's anything that impacts the image of God in that regard. I think it's just the process is different. Because in the end, if God breathes that soul into a person, that person is a human being. You've got the fleshly part, then you got the soulish part, and that person becomes a human being. It's just that the process is a little different. But one could even argue that if a husband and wife are desperately want to have children, and they've gone all out to try to have this child, even though it didn't come by the normal process, it's still an act of love, you might say, to go to that extent, to go to those lengths to try to have that child.
So then on our podcast, or on your podcast on the institution of marriage, I thought that was great. I thought, but
Oh,
man, Brian, you're just nailing down some good stuff here. The thought came to my mind when we were talking about the image of God prior, a few podcasts, and we had kind of been discussing it throughout the group, for a while. And this question came up in my mind when you had that. I wish I could have been there to be able to ask this, because this question,
and let me just
does
say, now
the
that we're working these
institution,
things out, we're going to get you more involved next season.
yeah, yeah, it does the institution of marriage affect the Imago Dei, the image of God, by union of two becoming one flesh? Like, is it, and this is the question, is it one each, then one together?
Man, you just throwing some hard balls here. You're talking throwing some fastballs
Yeah.
here. Uh, another great question. I think that the image of God is something individually given. So we all
Mm-hmm.
bear that image of God. And I don't think that's something that necessarily is combined in the marital process. Now, I think whenever the Bible tells us that we're made one flesh, I think what this is talking about is that we're enjoined by the bonds of marriage. But Jesus tells us, and this kind of goes into the next question as well. Jesus tells us that marriage doesn't continue on into the afterlife, into heaven. Now, that doesn't mean that if the husband and wife are both born again believers, that they don't still have a strong relationship in heaven. They do. But here's what the Bible tells us when it comes to marriage. We, as the people of God, are part of what's called the bride of Christ. And we, as the bride of Christ, we're joined to Jesus the Messiah and that marriage supper of the Lamb. It's like almost like a marriage ceremony where the people of God are essentially, if you want to say, married to God, and God is married to us. It's an unbreakable relationship. And so, really, if you think about it, just as the earthly temple was a symbol of the heavenly temple at the throne room of God, so these earthly marriages that we have are a symbol of that eternal relationship that we have with God. There's a word for this, and and it just left me. It's a difficult word, and it won't come to my mind. But there's a word that talks about TJ. If TJ is on, he'll have to throw me a line here. Uh, but there's a word that talks about us being entered into the triune relationship of God. Is it? It's not transpartite. I can't remember what it is. Anyhow, whatever, it doesn't matter. But we're ushered into that relationship with God. And when we get to that panel discussion on the unseen realm, I think that's going to be part of the discussion, because you have this heavenly divine council. It's almost like you'd say the family of God, so to speak. But we're part of that family of God. We're going to be glorified beings. That's why in the resurrection of Jesus, people who say it's a physical resurrection, they're right. People who say it's a spiritual resurrection, they're also right, because it's both. It's a glorified body. It's like this body, but it's this body 2.0. The spiritual and physical. It's almost, I've been thinking of it almost like, if you think of, you got a solid, you got a liquid, then you can have a plasma. You have plasma. It's almost like that resurrected body's like plasma. It's it interacts with the spiritual and the physical in a way that this body just can't. Um, but all that being said, is I think we're going to be enjoined together with God, and this marriage that we have down here on earth is just but a foretaste of that greater marriage that's going to happen in heaven, when the people of God are essentially, if you want to say it this way, married to God in this unbreakable relationship that extends for all eternity. Now, we've already mentioned it, but some people say, well, wait a minute, when you have, what about you talk about the honeymoon, you talk about all these physical emotions and all these physical chemical reactions that bring such joy. Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever had a genuine encounter with the Holy Spirit and you feel that unspeakable love and you feel that unspeakable joy when you're downtrodden and you don't think there's a way out? The Spirit of God comes upon you and just gives you goosebumps from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. And you know that, I mean, it's just enraptured. You're enraptured with the presence of the Holy Spirit. That is but a foretaste of what awaits in heaven. Now, don't take that as dirty. It's not dirty. It's not talking about anything dirty in that sense, but it's a holy, righteous, eternal relationship between God and his people for all eternity.
Hey, so then number 5, this is the question that kind of came up mostly because you know, the Mormons hold a view of marriage that's in heaven. There's various other religions that hold certain views of marriage in heaven. So many other religions hold a view of marriage of a married couple. What makes Christianity's view different?
Well, I think kind of what we just mentioned. I think the relationship itself, the marriage relationship is great. Listen, I got a wonderful relationship with my wife.
Yeah.
But that pales in comparison to the relationship we have with God. And I think that the focus in Christianity is not just the relationship we have with each other, but it's also the relationship we have with God. Now, my wife is a Christian. Your wife, Curtis, Christina, she's a Christian. So all four of us will be in heaven, and you and Christina will have a special relationship. Jennifer and I will have a special relationship, but it won't be the same as it is here because it'll be even better. Because even as married couples, there are times I know when I get on my wife's nerves.
No. You?
Yeah,
Oh.
I know. There's times when I get on my wife's nerves. So think about this. We're going to be perfected in heaven, and that means we're going to be able to have a perfect relationship with each other. And God's going to have a perfect relationship with us. We're going to have a perfect relationship with Him. So I think these views, and I mean no disrespect to anybody, but I think the views that see heaven as a continuation of marriage on earth is shortchanging what heaven is going to be. Because I think that the ultimate
Good point.
relationship we have is not with each other. That's a very important relationship, and it's one we need to focus on. We need to strengthen marital bonds, strengthen relationships in the home, strengthen relationships in the church and with each other. But all of that is only possible because of the relationship we have with God. That's why the first and most important commandment is to love the Lord our God with all of our soul, mind, and strength. And so, anyhow, I think those other views, while I understand them, I think they shortchange the glories of eternity.
So on the Transhumanism podcast, the panel discussion that we had, I thought about this in kind of, it's going to be a weird question, but I thought about this one. With the onset of AI becoming more available and more widely used, what are some problems or what could be problems affecting legal rights being given to potential AI entities? For example, like your last will and testament, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a great question, Curtis, and I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that. I wish I did. I do think that it's. I think there's potential problems out there, but I don't know right now that we even know the length and depths that this will go. But I do want to read you
Mm-hmm.
something because as we talk about AI, Um, the AI of today is going to pale in comparison to the AI that we're going to see in 10 years from now.
Oh yeah.
Not because of AI, but because of something else. I've just got this book. I just have started reading it, so I can't tell you much about what's in it. But it's a book called by Michio Kaku, Quantum Supremacy. Quantum computers are going to be what make AI above and beyond anything you can imagine. Because in the very first page, like I said, I didn't get a chance. My goal was to have read more of this book by the time of the podcast. But I want you to hear what Keiko says. Now, quantum computers, let me just say this, are going to act on the very atomic structure of the universe, meaning that they're like electrons use electricity, or excuse me, as electricity uses electrons, the passing of electrons, that's how we have electricity. This stuff is using similar type of technology on a grander scale, going to the quantum world. Now we talk of modern computers having bytes, megabytes, gigabytes, what does it now, terabytes? I think it's now terabytes. They're already outdated because 1 gigabyte, well, actually not gigabyte, they're called quantum bits. One qubit, which is a quantum bit, is 1,000,000 times more powerful than a computer with several terabytes. Listen what Google said. This is revealed on the very first page of Quantum Supremacy. Google revealed that their Sycamore quantum computer could solve a mathematical problem in 200 seconds that would normally take 10,000 years on the world's fastest supercomputer. That's the level of power we're talking about with these quantum computers when they come out. They're not available yet, but they will be. And I watched a special on ABC. I think it was CBS. It was CBS, and they said, and they gave this example. If you think of a maze, modern computers using the transistors will look at a maze, and say they'll say there are 5 options, and say this option is the best one. So what it'll do is it'll take this option, go first this way. Then it'll go back, it's a dead end. It'll go to this option, it's a dead end. Then it'll go to this option, well, that's successful. Well, what if this one is the right pathway? Well, then it would go individually to each one of these until it found the right pathway. With quantum computers, they automatically look at all 5 pathways and can instantly tell you which one's right. The level and complexity of quantum computers surpasses anything that we've ever seen. Now, the only problem is the processors have to be cooled down to nearly absolute zero. So that's the biggest problem they have with getting the technology out there. But once they're able to resolve that, the nation, and there are several nations fighting for this technology, the nation that gets it first is going to have a huge advantage on other nations. But here's the problem we have. When that level of complexity, that level of processing power is added to, combined with AI, you're talking about computer technology that can know what you're going to choose from your past behaviors, know that what you're going to choose before you ever choose it. It's insanity. So, talking about legal rights, that's why it's important to have the discussions about what's moral and immoral, what's ethically right and wrong. That's why it's important to have those discussions now before this type of technology rolls out. I do think there need to be certain things set in place to protect rights because, folks, I mean, I don't believe computers will ever, they're never going to be living beings as we're living beings. But the level of intellect that they have, it's, in my mind, it's scary, but only if it's misused and misapplied. So I think there can be some wonderful things that come from this technology if they're used the way they're supposed to be. But there need to be restrictions because knowing human beings and knowing human nature, there need to be restrictions placed on the technology now to avoid future problems. So, to answer your question, Curtis, that's a long way around answering your question. I don't know what that answer is right now, but I do know that we need to be having those conversations and setting things in place to protect humanity from the advances that are coming.
Mm.
And they are coming.
Yeah. Well, on to the doctrine of sin. The doctrine of sin final podcast last week. Once we are saved, are we still, quote unquote, sinners saved by grace, or are we perfect in the flesh?
I think we're still sinners saved by grace in this realm. There's a big question, and this is especially true in Wesleyan theology about being perfected. And I think what John Wesley meant by that was not what we often associate with being perfect. Because we often think of being perfect as being sinless. Wesley knew
Mm-hmm.
just as well as anyone else that on this earth we're going to have temptations and we're going to still sin. I think
Yeah.
if I'm understanding Wesley correct, I think what he was talking about was more along the lines of being fully submissive. That's what he meant by being perfected. Now, has there been anyone outside of Jesus who was fully submissive to the Father's will? I don't think so. I mean, because we always have that temptation to fall back in our old former ways, and so I think that we're in a process of being sanctified, meaning that each and every passing day we're being made more and more in the likeness of Christ until, and that's those that talk speaks of those three steps of salvation. We're justified, made right in God's eyes. Sanctified, we're in the process of being made perfect, being perfected in the image of Christ. But then glorification is when that actually happens, when we're glorified before the Father, not only in that heavenly home when we get there, but also in the resurrection that happens ultimately with that new resurrected body. Then is where we'll be perfected, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, even in our own lives, there are things that God brings up to the surface, and we have that choice to correct those sinful acts or those behaviors to become even more and more perfected, so to speak, on this earth. And that's the job of the Holy Spirit, to bring those things up to the surface.
Absolutely.
So number 8, can a person that is still willfully sinning be a Christian?
This is a tricky question because I think it depends on whether or not a person is completely resistant to the things of the Spirit. Now, when John says be perfect, when he talks about anyone who sins is not of the Father, the Greek in that text speaks of someone who continually, willfully rejects the Spirit, rejects the things of God. So it's talking about an ongoing process. But John, just as Paul, knew that we're all going to make mistakes, we're all going to mess up, and there may be times where God tells us to do something when we say, "I don't want to do that." Take Jonah for instance. Jonah was an excellent example of that. He only went to Nineveh kicking and screaming because God kept pushing him along the way. So we're all going to make mistakes. I kind of think of, and I'm not going to mention the person's name. I wouldn't want to embarrass him. He's gone to be with the Lord now. But I think of a person years ago that I knew who was addicted to drugs. He got saved. He received the Lord, and I believe in my heart of hearts that he is a Christian. But he still struggled with that temptation of the drugs. He had it was difficult for him to break that, and unfortunately, he never broke the relationship with his former friends, and they kept dragging him back into it. And he eventually
Yeah.
died from his addictions. I believe in my heart of hearts that he is in heaven now, but I believe that he struggled with those temptations and just didn't have the strength to resist it. Some people God will get a hold of them and he completely removes the temptations and they're able to segment themselves away from the former friends and just completely change. And God has that power, he can do it. But for this guy, he really struggled. He tried. I believe he did try with all of his
Mm.
heart to quit it, but he couldn't get away from the people who kept dragging him back down that road. And
Mm.
so I want to be cautious because I mean Jesus says by your fruit you're known, but I also think the good Lord knows that we all have struggles, we all have temptations, and everybody's tempted by different things. Some people may be
Yeah.
tempted more by drugs. Another person may be tempted by beautiful women. Another one may be tempted by alcohol. Another one may be tempted by greed and money, or maybe having a big name. Whatever the case may be, we're all tempted by different things. So that's something to take into consideration. We all have our flaws. We all have our problems. We're all going to mess up. But I think it's the continual focus. Are we repentant? Are we striving to do better? Are we seeking the Lord? I think that's the trait of someone who's really truly born again. They're going to produce fruit. And Paul tells us that that's love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. Sometimes with him, he tried self-control, but he wasn't always successful with it.
Right. So on to something that a topic that you and I both just are enamored with, you could say. It just intrigues me to no end on this. And I kind of like the great Gary Habermas. Some days I wake up and I'm 50% sure that it is, and then there's days I wake up I'm 99% sure. So here it is, the Shroud of Turin. The question 9: how would you respond to the blood analysis of the Shroud of Turin, especially those who claim that the blood flow does not match what would be expected on a death shroud?
So this is a recent study that has caused some to cast doubt on the authenticity of the shroud. And by the
Mm-hmm.
way, recently around Easter time, I published an article on new evidence to support the authenticity of the
Mm-hmm.
shroud. But this is a study done by forensic analysis where they studied the blood flow on a mannequin, and they filled this mannequin with blood-like fluids, and then they stabbed it in certain areas to see how the blood would flow out of the mannequin and matched what they saw on the shroud. And what they found is that the blood flow did not match the blood flow found on the shroud, and so then they deduced, well, there's no way that this could be authentic because it's not realistic. The person who was in the shroud was standing up instead of lying down, and so that makes no sense. And so they're wanting to say, well, there's no way it could be genuine. I say not so fast. I say not so fast. One, we do
Not
know
so
that he
fast,
was
my friend.
vertical. We do know he was vertical. He was vertical on a cross. And by the way,
Right.
I had to go get a procedure done, and my vein busted. So if you see that bruise on my arm, that's what that's all.
Youch.
But anyhow, and maybe that's the perfect time to talk about bruises and blood flow and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But he's vertical. He's hanging vertical on a cross. Rigor mortis. By the way, I spoke to a good friend of mine who has actually he's actually has befriended and seen the strips of pollen that they took from the shroud and was able to view them under a microscope. And he's actually met some of the guys on STIRP which is one of these big leading research areas. And he said that he is absolutely convinced that the Shroud of Turin is authentic, that it's legitimate. But anyhow, talking about this, he brought up the point that you have rigor mortis setting in by the time they got the body down off the shroud. You also have the congealing of blood that happened after that time. Now, yeah, you still have a massive gash under the left pectoral muscle going up through the ribs where the heart is. You still have a large amount of blood flow coming from there and coming out of the wrists. But the rest of the body would likely have been they're not as fresh of wounds as you would find with the blood flow coming out of the chest and where the nails were taken out of the hands and the feet. Those are fresher wounds than the rest of the blood flow. As they were taking him down off the cross, chances are highly likely that they may have even had internal strips of linen that they wrapped around the body and then had the shroud over top of those linens encasing the body. So I don't think that study has taken into consideration those certain points. Because I mean, who knows? We know from the Bible, they had to rush to get the body down off the cross, placed in a tomb. They didn't have time to put all of the ointments and salves and the spices and things that they would have to normally adorn the body, or perfumes and what have you. They didn't have that ability. They may have put some on there, but they didn't have the ability to put everything that they normally would on a body. So anyhow, that we do know that there were linens on the inside. They're taking them down. So the blood flow, naturally speaking, would not necessarily have completely matched what you would see if it were just placed fresh on the slab. So they're placing this body on this shroud. They're jabbing it, fresh wounds coming out, wrapping the shroud over the body and testing it. But here you have a body that's been hanging up on a cross. So the blood has likely congealed in certain areas, the wounds congealed, so it's maybe not flowing as fresh as it once did. Then you take it down, rigor mortis setting in. You see the hands are over each other, very stiff, over each other. The body is contorted in the shape that you would see of a crucified victim. I don't think that the study is as foolproof as they're promoting it to be. Now, having said that, you also have some things that you cannot describe by physical means alone.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the shroud, well, first of all, you have pollen grains that date to the first century coming from plants exclusively only found in Jerusalem, dating to the first century. These plants only bloom in late March and early April. Time of Passover, time of the crucifixion. Most likely, I hold to the now my mentor Gary Habermas, he holds to the year 30, which would have been crucifixion April 7th, 30 AD, resurrection April 9th. I hold to the year 33. I don't disagree with Dr. Habermas much, but here's where an area where I do. I think the year 33 more likely matches the data, in my opinion. So you're talking about April 3rd, 33 AD, 333, and then the resurrection happening on April 5th, 33 AD. Regardless, you're only talking about a few years apart. But regardless of all that, it dates to the first century. These wide X-ray analysis of the shroud. By the way, let me say the carbon-14 dating has been shown to be falsified. They said, I didn't know a whole lot about the shroud, but I had done a little bit of studies in the 80s whenever they done this, and automatically I was skeptical of that dating because it is a well-known fact that the shroud caught on fire in the medieval ages and was repaired by a group of nuns. You see watermarks on the shroud, and you see two parallel lines where the fire broke out on the shroud. They put it out with water. But they patched up the shroud, and especially in that corner, they have a patch that's built on there to keep the shroud from unraveling. They took a part of the patchwork and tested it. They didn't take a part of the authentic shroud. They took a piece of the patchwork. So no wonder it dated to the medieval ages, because that piece of cloth did come from the medieval ages. but not the internal part of the shroud. But even more, in my mind, convincing is look at the face on the shroud, and especially look at the teeth and look real closely. Because if you look there, you will see the individual, see like my teeth here, you see the individual teeth? You see the individual teeth in the mouth. Habermas in a conference, I heard him say one time before that he took the picture of the shroud and took it to a dentist friend of his. And he says, what do you see when you look at this, especially at the mouth? And his dentist says, that's the best set of x-rays, dental x-rays I've ever seen in my life. Because that's the type of image you would have. The image on the shroud is an x-ray. It came from radiation. By the way, Chris Berg, a friend I'm telling you about, there's another cloth that wrapped the head called the Sedarium of Aveo. It has the same type of blood that's found on the shroud, type AB blood, that's also been identified with the ancient Hebrews. It's a very rare form of blood, but it's been identified and associated with ancient Hebrews. Very few other people have that type of blood. AB blood found on the shroud, also found on the Sedarium of Aveo, also dated to the 1st century, and the blood stains of this cloth, when placed over the head, matches the blood stains on the shroud, even the flow found on the head. Now, Chris brought this out to me as I was talking with him this week. There's a reason why you don't see a face on the Sedarium, because that cloth was not on the body when the resurrection happened. The shroud was. Right. So a recent study was done by an Italian group of energy engineers, and they have determined that this type of image, which is found on just a few fibers of the shroud, down at the molecular level, chemical reactions won't do that. But they use lasers to produce a similar image, and they determined that it would take an energy source emitting something like 13 trillion watts of vacuum ultraviolet radiation to produce an image comparable to what you see on the shroud. We don't have anything today that can produce that type of UV radiation. They certainly didn't have it in the medieval ages, and they most assuredly didn't have it in the 1st century. You're talking about energy so powerful that it's on a cosmic level. You're talking about the closest thing that they compare this to is ultraviolet radiation coming from a dwarf galaxy. Now, here's the amazing thing. If that type of energy was associated by heat energy, which it wasn't, if it was associated with 13 trillion watts of ultraviolet radiation, if that was associated along with heat, accompanying heat energy, not only would you not have a shroud, you wouldn't have a body, you likely wouldn't have a cave, you may not even have a Middle East.
Wouldn't have the Earth.
You wouldn't have the Earth itself. I mean, that is an unreal amount of radiation coming, and they determined that radiation come out of the body. It came from inside of the body, inside out, in a moment of light, in around 140th billionth of a second. That's how fast we're talking about. Now, the amazing thing is, actually, I'm going to wait and let you ask the last question before I get into that.
So what you're saying, it would be like multiple nuclear power sites blowing up all at the same time.
Yeah, because I even looked at how much energy a nuclear power plant puts out. And I think in a year's time, I think it was something like 4 to 5 billion watts of electricity in a year's time. But you're talking about 13 trillion watts of UV radiation coming from a dead corpse, unaccompanied by anyone, in a cave. Person who'd been beaten to death. The dumbbell shapes in the back match the flagrums used by the Romans in the 1st century. The style of the crown of thorns that they placed upon his head matched what was used in the Middle East. And even the crucifixion nail prints match what an authentic crucifixion would have looked like in the medieval ages. They thought that the nails went here, but no, the shroud shows it in the accurate spot right here.
Yep.
It's just the more you study the shroud, the more bizarre it becomes.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, everybody, you can think logically about if a nail was put through the hand, it would just rip the hand right out.
Absolutely.
Where it's gone through the wrist, it has all that other bone to support it, which is gruesome in itself, but nonetheless, the Romans perfected that, by probably seeing several people fall off.
Absolutely.
So then, number 10, do you believe that the Shroud of Turin is the actual burial cloth of Jesus?
Well, let me say first and foremost that we don't need the burial cloth of Jesus. We don't need the Shroud of Turin to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. Around Easter, I also wrote an article giving 33 reasons why you should believe in the resurrection. I don't think I added the Shroud of Turin, but even if I did, it'd be 32. But I don't think I did.
Right.
33 reasons, and quite frankly, I think that you could probably come up with closer to 50 reasons to believe in the resurrection of Jesus if you wanted. Um, there are wonderful reasons, historically valid reasons to accept the resurrection of Jesus as a real historical event. However, looking at the data for the Shroud of Turin, I have to say, archaeologist Ted Wright said that he was 95% sure the shroud was authentic. I have to say that I'm probably getting closer along the lines of 98% sure that the Shroud of Turin is authentic, especially with this latest data that's come out. With the UV radiation required to produce this image, with the actual blood being AB hemoglobin, being that of a human being, even found DNA on it, and the AB type blood matches ancient Hebrews, the blood type of ancient Hebrews, and is a very rare type of blood type at that. In addition to all these other details, the facts of finding pollen grains on it that in Jerusalem, it matching the Sudarium of Aveo, and all these other things, I have to believe, I have to deduce and hold that the Shroud of Turin is the real article. It's legitimate, and I think it also tells us, in my mind, as I looked at the shroud, I looked at the data coming in over the past few years. I think it not only gives us a glimpse of what Jesus went through in the crucifixion, but with this latest data, I think it also gives us a glimpse as to what to expect with our own resurrection. Jesus said that when the rapture happens, it's going to be as fast as a streak of lightning. He said, to quote him verbatim, as a lightning flashes to the east to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. And if this data holds true and the Shroud of Turin is legitimate, in 1 to 140th billionth of a second, 13 trillion watts of ultraviolet radiation illuminated that dark cave. The Romans locked them in, but the Romans couldn't hold them in. Satan tried everything in his power to fill darkness in the world, but in a moment of radiation energy of immense galactic proportions, life defeated death, light overcame the darkness, and in that moment, Jesus defeated death, hell, and the grave. Now, what does that tell us? The Bible tells us that Jesus is the first fruits, that Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits of our resurrection. So I think what that tells us is that in a flash of light, quicker than we can even imagine, will be taken. I used to think that maybe you'd see this parade in the skies, Jesus just come galloping in the skies, coming from Jerusalem, going around the world, and just galloping around. I don't know that I believe that anymore. I believe he's going to come down, and perhaps on the Mount of Olives or above it, whatever the case may be. He's going to call us home, and in a flash of light, in a moment's notice, we're going to be instantaneously transformed. The dead in Christ will be with him immediately, and then those of us who are alive and remain, bam, just like that, will be gone. I think it validates our own resurrection and what to expect when the time should come. And friends, I'm just going to say it can happen any moment. I really do. I believe it. It can
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was questioning whether the rapture happened or not the other day when I was watching an elephant go walking down the street in the middle of Butte, Montana. I was like, what the heck? What the heck is this? An elephant? That was the craziest thing I've ever seen. And I was like, what did I just see? So, some of the things you see around here.
What was it your wife put on the Facebook? I think it was that y'all had. How much snow did y'all have the other day?
Yeah, about an inch and a half, somewhere in there. Yeah.
So I think she put.
Couple inches of snow.
Well, maybe it was your mom. It was either Chris or your mom once said that people who moved to Montana is not going to know what to expect because they had an elephant roam around in Butte, and then all of a sudden in mid-April had snow on the ground. So
This is normal. This is just normal stuff, people. Just don't worry about it. Yeah. Yeah. It's been some wild stuff lately. Yeah.
well, brother,
Well, there it is, folks. That's the last of our question zone. Last for the year or for the season. I know Brian and I, we've struggled with some technology issues and some things, and we know we're working real hard to make this all come together to where we can produce content that you people will enjoy. We'll be able to hear clearer and clearly, and we're just praying that the Lord blesses this in a way that we will be able to even create better and better and better content for you folks. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Please don't be strangers. Go ahead and send questions in. We will answer them. We will do what we can. And look forward to some of the other short episodes that we will probably have on between the seasons, like we did last year. As it is, Brian and I say now go out and live Christ-centered with others around you. Good night.